The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the community center. The annual Harmony Festival was in full swing, a well-intentioned effort to bridge the divides that often simmered beneath the surface of the small, historically segregated town of Oak Haven. Booths lined the perimeter, showcasing local crafts, offering information on community initiatives, and serving up classic Southern fare, barbecue, coleslaw, and sweet tea flowing freely. Sarah, a young woman in her late 20s, stood near the edge of the crowd. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple sundress, her usual attire. She had moved to Oak Haven from a large liberal city just a few years prior, drawn by the promise of a slower pace and a lower cost of living. However, she quickly found that the town's charm was often intertwined with deeply entrenched social issues. Pastor Johnson, a tall, imposing figure with a warm smile and a booming voice, stood on a makeshift stage. He was a pillar of the black community in Oak Haven, the pastor of the oldest and largest black church in town, and a respected voice for civil rights and social justice. Today, he was scheduled to give a short speech about the importance of unity and understanding. Sarah listened with a growing sense of unease as Pastor Johnson spoke. His words were carefully chosen, filled with references to shared values and the need to overcome historical injustices. He spoke of building bridges and finding common ground. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his message was glossing over the harsh realities of Oak Haven, the subtle but pervasive discrimination that she had witnessed since moving there. He said, "We are all children of God, and we must treat each other with respect and dignity. We must put aside our differences and work together to create a better future for all of us, especially our children. It is important for us to show them love, understanding, and compassion for all people. Let us not allow bitterness to consume us. Let us all walk hand in hand toward the future together." He paused, took a sip of water, and continued. "We all have a responsibility to uphold these values, and by doing so, we honor our ancestors who fought so hard for the freedoms that we have today." He then began to talk about some local community issues that were brought up in the town's latest town hall meeting. One of the items discussed was the placement of a new community center. "We must ensure that this new community center is accessible to all members of our community," he said. "It should be a place where people from all walks of life can come together to learn, grow, and connect." Sarah watched as people in the crowd nodded in agreement. She saw the black faces, the white faces, all seemingly united in their approval of Pastor Johnson's message. But she felt a growing sense of frustration. She had attended town hall meetings where the location of the community center was discussed, and she knew that the proposed location was in a predominantly white neighborhood, far from the black community. She had heard whispers of resistance to building the center in a more central location, whispers about property values and undesirable elements. She had seen the subtle ways in which the white residents of Oak Haven maintained their dominance, often without even realizing they were doing it. The frustration boiled over. She knew she shouldn't, that it was disrespectful, inappropriate, but she couldn't hold it in any longer. As Pastor Johnson finished his speech and the crowd began to applaud, Sarah pushed her way to the front, her face flushed with anger. "Pastor Johnson," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The applause died down, and all eyes turned to her. Pastor Johnson looked surprised, but remained calm. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice gentle. "With all due respect," Sarah began, "I don't think you're being honest with these people. You're talking about unity and understanding, but you're ignoring the reality of what's happening in this town." A murmur went through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably, their smiles fading. Pastor Johnson raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanged. "And what reality is that, ma'am?" "The reality that this town is still segregated," Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising. "The reality that the new community center is being built in a white neighborhood, making it inaccessible to the black community. The reality that black residents are still facing discrimination in housing and employment." Her words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Some people in the crowd gasped, while others stared at her in disbelief. A few white faces hardened, their expressions turning hostile. Pastor Johnson remained remarkably composed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still calm, "I understand your concerns, but I believe that we can work together to address these issues in a constructive way. Shouting accusations in public is not the way to achieve progress. But how else are we supposed to make progress? Sarah retorted, her voice cracking. By being polite and patient while nothing changes? By pretending that everything is fine when it's not? Progress is made through dialogue, through understanding, through building relationships, Pastor Johnson replied. It is not made through division and anger. But what about justice? Sarah demanded. What about the people who have been waiting for justice for generations? Are they supposed to keep waiting patiently while you talk about building relationships? She paused, taking a deep breath. I'm sorry, she said, her voice softening slightly. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm tired of seeing the same problems persist year after year, and I'm tired of people pretending that everything is okay. A young black man stepped forward from the crowd, his eyes fixed on Sarah. Maybe you should listen to the pastor, he said, his voice low but firm. He knows what he's doing. He's been fighting for our community for a long time. I know, Sarah replied, and I respect that. But sometimes I think we need to be more direct, more forceful. Sometimes we need to call things out for what they are, even if it makes people uncomfortable. An older white woman spoke up, her voice laced with disapproval. Young lady, you're causing a scene. This is a community event, not a political rally. I'm not trying to cause a scene, Sarah said, her voice weary. I'm just trying to speak the truth. Your truth, the woman retorted. Not everyone sees things the way you do. Sarah looked around at the faces in the crowd, the black faces, the white faces, the mixed faces. She saw a range of emotions, anger, confusion, disapproval, curiosity, even a hint of agreement. She realized that she had opened a Pandora's box, unleashing a torrent of unspoken tensions and unresolved conflicts. Pastor Johnson stepped forward again, placing a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. Ma'am, he said, his voice kind, I appreciate your passion, but I believe that we can continue this conversation in a more private setting. Perhaps we could meet at my office next week? Sarah looked at Pastor Johnson's face, at his calm, patient eyes. She saw a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice, a man who had seen far more injustice than she could ever imagine, and she wondered if he was right. Maybe shouting accusations in public wasn't the way to achieve progress. Maybe dialogue and understanding were the only way forward. But then she thought about the new community center, about its location in the white neighborhood, about the subtle ways in which the black community was still being marginalized. And she wondered if dialogue and understanding were enough. She looked back at the crowd, at the faces that were still watching her, waiting for her to speak. Okay, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll meet with you. She paused, then added, but I'm not going to stop speaking the truth. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Pastor Johnson and the crowd in the stunned silence. The sun continued to sink lower in the sky, casting even longer shadows across the lawn. The Harmony Festival, once a celebration of unity, now felt like a battlefield, a place where the war for racial justice was still being waged. The air grew tense as everyone watched Sarah walk away, and people began to whisper, their voices hushed with unease. Pastor Johnson, his face a mask of thoughtful contemplation, continued to stand on the makeshift stage, his gaze following Sarah's retreating figure. A question hung in the air. Had Sarah's outburst been a destructive act of defiance, or a necessary catalyst for change? Sarah walked quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and a touch of defiant pride. She could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on her back, a mixture of judgment and curiosity. She didn't look back, didn't want to see the expressions on their faces. She just wanted to get away, to escape the stifling atmosphere of the Harmony Festival. She reached the edge of the lawn and stepped onto the sidewalk, her pace quickening. She walked past the booths, past the laughter and music, past the remnants of a celebration that now felt like a hollow mockery. As she walked, she replayed the scene in her mind, wondering if she had done the right thing. Had she been too aggressive? Too confrontational? Had she alienated the very people she was trying to reach? She thought about Pastor Johnson, about his calm demeanor and his words of wisdom. She respected him, admired his dedication to his community. But she also felt that he was too willing to compromise, too willing to accept the status quo. She believed that sometimes you had to shake things up, to challenge the comfortable assumptions that allowed injustice to persist. She reached her small apartment above a bakery on Main Street. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, a comforting aroma that usually soothed her nerves. But today it did little to calm her racing thoughts. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind her. She threw her purse on the small kitchen table and went to the living room window, looking out at the street below. She could still see people leaving the Harmony Festival, their faces illuminated by the streetlights. She felt a pang of loneliness, a sense of isolation. She was an outsider in Oak Haven, a transplant from a different world. She didn't belong here, and perhaps she never would. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sarah hesitated, wondering who it could be. She wasn't expecting anyone. Could it be someone from the Harmony Festival, someone who wanted to confront her? She took a deep breath and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. It was Pastor Johnson. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect. Was he angry? Disappointed? She didn't know. She opened the door, her voice tentative. "Pastor Johnson," she said. "What are you doing here?" He smiled gently. "May I come in, Sarah?" he asked. "I think we need to talk." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Of course," she said. "Please come in." Pastor Johnson entered the apartment, his tall frame filling the small space. He looked around, his eyes taking in the simple furnishings, the books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls. "Thank you for having me," he said. "Of course," Sarah replied, feeling awkward and uncertain. "Would you like some water? Or tea?" "Water would be fine, thank you," he said. Sarah went to the kitchen and filled a glass with water, handing it to Pastor Johnson. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving her. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "I know I was disrespectful." Pastor Johnson shook his head. "There's no need to apologize, Sarah," he said. "I understand your passion. I know that you care deeply about justice." "But I shouldn't have shouted at you in public," Sarah said. "That wasn't fair to you or to anyone else." "Perhaps not," Pastor Johnson said. "But sometimes passion can lead us to do things we later regret. The important thing is to learn from our mistakes and to move forward." He paused, then added, "I came here because I wanted to understand your perspective. I wanted to know why you felt so strongly about these issues." Sarah took a deep breath. "It's just, I've seen so much injustice since I moved here," she said. "The subtle discrimination, the unequal opportunities, the way the Black community is often ignored or overlooked. It's not right and it's not fair." "I know," Pastor Johnson said. "I've seen it too. I've lived it." "But why aren't you doing more about it?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with frustration. "Why aren't you speaking out more forcefully? Why are you so willing to compromise?" Pastor Johnson sighed. "It's not always easy, Sarah," he said. "I have to consider the needs of my community, the political realities, the potential consequences of my actions. I can't just go around shouting accusations and alienating people. I have to be strategic, to choose my battles carefully. But sometimes you have to be willing to take risks," Sarah said. "Sometimes you have to be willing to make people uncomfortable." "I understand that," Pastor Johnson said, "and I appreciate your willingness to speak truth to power. But I also believe that change is best achieved through collaboration, through building relationships, through finding common ground." "But what if the people in power aren't willing to collaborate?" Sarah asked. "What if they're not willing to listen? What if they're only interested in protecting their own interests?" Pastor Johnson paused, his expression thoughtful. "Then we have to find other ways to make our voices heard," he said. "We have to organize, to mobilize, to use our collective power to demand change." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with sincerity. "But we can't do it alone," he said. "We need allies. We need people like you, who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Maybe she wasn't alone after all. Maybe there was a way to work together, to achieve real change in Oak Haven. "I want to help," she said. "I don't know what I can do, but I want to be part of the solution." Pastor Johnson smiled. That's all I ask, he said. Let's start with that meeting next week. We can discuss some concrete steps we can take to address these issues. He stood up, preparing to leave. Thank you for your honesty, Sarah, he said, and thank you for caring. He walked to the door, then turned back to face her. One more thing, he said. Don't underestimate the power of small acts of kindness and understanding. Sometimes the most effective way to change the world is to start with ourselves, to treat each other with respect and compassion, even when we disagree. With that, he left the apartment, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a sense of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was no longer willing to stand by and watch injustice persist. She was ready to fight for a better future for Oak Haven, for everyone. The following week, Sarah met with Pastor Johnson at his office. They discussed the issues facing the Black community, the challenges of achieving racial equality in Oak Haven. They talked about the new community center, about the need to ensure that it was accessible to all residents. Pastor Johnson shared some of his strategies for working with the town council, for building relationships with influential members of the white community. He emphasized the importance of patience, of persistence, of finding common ground. Sarah shared her own ideas, her more direct and confrontational approach. She talked about organizing protests, about launching public awareness campaigns, about using social media to amplify their message. They didn't always agree, but they respected each other's perspectives. They realized that they needed both approaches, the patient diplomacy and the bold activism, to achieve real change. Over the next few months, Sarah and Pastor Johnson worked together, building a coalition of Black and white residents who were committed to racial justice. They organized community meetings, held workshops on racial bias, and launched a campaign to advocate for a more equitable location for the new community center. They faced resistance from some members of the white community who were unwilling to cede their privileged position. They were accused of being divisive, of stirring up trouble, but they refused to be silenced. Sarah learned the importance of listening, of understanding different perspectives, of finding common ground. She realized that change wasn't always easy or quick, but it was always possible. Pastor Johnson learned the importance of being bold, of challenging the status quo, of demanding justice. He realized that sometimes you had to be willing to take risks, to make people uncomfortable, to speak truth to power. Together, they made progress. They convinced the town council to reconsider the location of the new community center, eventually securing a site that was more accessible to the Black community. They launched programs to promote diversity and inclusion in local schools and businesses. They worked to address racial disparities in housing and employment. The changes were slow and incremental, but they were real. Oak Haven was still a long way from being a truly equitable community, but it was moving in the right direction. 1 year after the Harmony Festival incident, Sarah and Pastor Johnson stood on the stage of the newly opened community center, a symbol of their collective efforts. They spoke to a crowd of Black and white residents, celebrating the progress they had made and recommitting themselves to the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Sarah looked out at the faces in the crowd, the Black faces, the white faces, the mixed faces. She saw a sense of hope, a sense of unity, a sense of possibility. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she also knew that they were on the right path. She smiled, her heart filled with gratitude and determination. She had found her place in Oak Haven, her purpose in life. She was no longer an outsider, a transplant from a different world. She was part of something bigger, something more meaningful. She was part of a movement to create a better future for all. Pastor Johnson stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. "We still have a long way to go," he said, his voice booming with conviction. "But together, we can overcome any obstacle. Together, we can build a community where everyone is treated with respect and dignity. Together, we can create a world where justice prevails." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing through the community center. Sarah looked at Pastor Johnson, her eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. She knew that they would continue to work together, to fight for what was right, to make a difference in the world. As the applause subsided, Sarah glanced out the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town of Oak Haven. She knew that the future was uncertain, that there would be challenges and setbacks along the way, but she also knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that they had the power to create a better world. As she stood there next to Pastor Johnson, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. She was home, and she was ready to continue the fight for as long as it took until justice was finally achieved for all.